Most people think they know what they're looking for. They really do think at the beginning of the search that they know what they're looking for. And about 90% of the time, they end up hiring someone who is not what they originally thought they were going to be hiring.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of How Many CTOs podcast. I'm Brad Hefta-Gaub, and my co-host is...
Scott Porad.
And today we have a very special guest with us, Dave Hardwick. Dave and I have known each other as long as I've been a professional software developer.
Actually, predating you being a professional software developer.
That's true. Technically, I was just an IT guy and a QA guy before I became a developer. That's when we first met.
Just.
Yeah. All right. Hey, introduce yourself, Dave, and tell us a little bit about what brought you here to the How Many CTOs podcast.
Okay, I'm Dave Hardwick, and I'm a technical recruiter by profession these days. I've had, as Brad has noted, a long history in startups. And before I was a technical recruiter, I did technical support and related sorts of things. So long history there. And we're here to talk about recruiting. I saw one of their earlier episodes where they had another CTO on, and they were talking about hiring practices and like that. And it was really a timely thing because I just gotten off of a podcast with someone who was talking, another recruiter was talking about recruiting for technical talent and stuff, and it just really kind of lit my fire because there just felt like there were big blank spots in that discussion that made me realize that there's a lot of things that we do as recruiters that CTOs and hiring managers don't necessarily know that we do, and also vice versa. And there's a lot of very interesting things going on in recruiting right now, just as there are really interesting things going on in software engineering right now. A lot of it centered on AI, but others of it is around process and how we work through things and stuff. So it just seems like a time to talk about all those things.
So, Dave, welcome aboard. And my question for you, kind of getting that first topic, is what is the way that you've seen that, CTOs and recruiter, how does that marriage or partnership work best? And I guess even to put a finer point on it, what do we, the CTOs, need to be doing that we're not doing?
It's a great question. I'm always, whenever I get to work with a CTO, I'm always really impressed with breadth and depth of their knowledge and how the bases they have to cover off to be successful. It's not just technical, it's about the business. Usually by the time people get to that role, they've got a really good handle on, all kinds of metrics, how businesses make money, how they fail, how teams fail, how things work with product and growth and all the things. So it's really usually it can be a really good conversation. Most recruiters are not technical, even if they are a technical recruiter. They've never coded, they know how to use technology and stuff, and they're usually pretty smart people too. But there's just gaps that exist. And like I was doing a search in the winter this last year, and I was interviewing candidates for software engineering roles and stuff. And the other recruiters I was working with, one of them finally said, "Hey, can you record one of your calls? Because we're getting feedback that's unusual, and in a positive way, but we want to know what you're doing to see kind of what we would compare against kind of what we do." And it was just that, I was asking, we were looking at these senior engineers, like staff level engineers and stuff, and I was asking them how they go about training junior engineers, or how do you approach uh, code base and make it better over time? What are your approaches around those sorts of things, which are questions that most recruiters don't typically ask because it's not in the job description, right? But it's a key part of that role. And so I think I'm going a long way around the mulberry bush here, Scott. But I think that the thing is for me, and what I wonder about is what are the things that you would like to be able to discuss with a recruiter ahead of a search to help them to be successful in finding those roles and stuff. And like SDE2s probably aren't that hard, but as you come up the ladder for those more experienced roles and stuff, like how do you as a recruiter know that staff engineer is actually going to be positive add to the team?
It's interesting, Dave, that uh, I think what you're scratching at there, I wonder how much of that is that as CTOs or as hiring managers for senior engineering roles, is that we're just bad at describing what we want, or are we bad at even knowing what we want?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, that's a great question.
Maybe both.
Yeah. I'm just like, okay. Yeah. So I don't think it's that you don't know what you want. I think especially for more senior positions, you start with a notion of this is what we need to solve for. And I think this is the type of person we should be looking at. And you start going down the search and the recruiter starts bringing you people, or you start doing some of the searching yourself and you find some people and then you go, oh, you have a really great interview or a really bad interview with somebody, and you suddenly say, oh, no, we need to be going down this other path. So there's always this information thing that happens as you go through a recruiting process. Um, and it informs kind of the next decisions you make about who to hire and stuff. And so I think that's part of what you're asking, Scott, to answer that question. Um, and or Brad. And then
It's funny. Dave, I just recently felt like I had an experience like this where we're hiring an engineering manager role in the team that I'm on now.
mhm,
And I thought I had like a really clear vision of what I wanted
mhm,
and interviewed a couple candidates and they checked a lot of the boxes that I had.
mhm,
And then we moved them to the next level of having them talk to one of the engineers on the team.
yep,
And we're small enough that we don't have as structured of a process.
mhm,
And one of the things that I realized as I was explaining to this engineer, like, hey, you're going to interview this candidate. This is what I'm looking for. Um, and they started asking me questions like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I realized, like, of course, those were the things that I wanted.
uh,
And I had missed that in my interview loop. And so that developer's like, great, okay, we all agree that's what we want. I'll make sure I ask about that. I probe for
right,
that.
right, right,
But it was so like I mean I've been doing this a long time,
right.
and like it was pretty basic stuff. It was basically about like technical acumen,
Oh
and
wow.
you know,
Okay.
and I had basically just blown right past that around like, oh yeah, like, these people check, check, check. They're, great at team dynamics, great at like, kind of the small L leadership type stuff, great at like process, great at like, they seem like they had all the cultural check boxes checked, you know, and like legit, I just blew past like, wait a second, what is your expertise on this technology that we're using and it matters?
Yes, it does. It matters a lot. Like, can you
And that's
can you
such a
code
like it's such a simple,
idiomatically
it's such a
this language? Yeah.
exactly, and even though as an engineering manager, you're not necessarily expecting them to do coding, but you definitely want them to be able to be good, guides and mentors to the developers and help adjudicate the process that develop. But to me, that's just like an emblematic story of like, of course I know this,
Right.
and yet I even missed it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of had a little tell there too, where you were saying, well, we don't have much process and da da da. Da.
Yeah.
One of the things that, as a recruiter, I really push people on is get your cards developed. Show me this job description. What do you want them to do for the first year or accomplish? And in an early stage startup, that's hard to know, really. you like you said, you like there are these things that were in your mind, all those things that were in your mind, they're totally terribly critical for success for that role. But there are additional pieces too that need to be addressed across the number of people who are going to be interviewing and stuff. And it's especially hard in a smaller startup because you want to be running light and nimble and fast and stuff, but the scorecards can really if they're regimented and stuff, they'll really help you hit those things that you forget about.
Well, I'm going to add something to the scorecard piece because I found that to be a very effective tool in my career.
Mhm.
And in order to share this, I have to share a little context. At the company I'm at now, we're not doing a ton of recruiting, but in places I've worked at before, we've hired very rapidly, and um, I've always kind of said, hey, first of all, being an effective interviewer and bringing the right people onto this team is a really important skill for us. Uh, and it's actually it's a transferable skill, meaning when you go to your next company, being able to be someone who can identify and recruit talent is really valuable. And
Mhm.
so scorecards are a way also of training people for what to look for. And it's
Yeah,
also a way, at least in my experience, just to democratize and scale a recruiting process. I first got into scorecards, a long time ago, when we had a bunch of people reviewing resumes, and everybody was doing it different. And so then we were like, okay, we're gonna make a scorecard here, and we're just gonna have a system like if you get 7 or more of these checked off, you get an interview, you get to the first round of the interviews, and if you don't, you don't. And there was one of the 10, there was 10 things on the list, and you could obviously get up to 10. One of the things was reviewer's choice, which was just like, well, there's something about this resume, I'm gonna give it a bonus point. Um, and that was a way that we drove consistency and started to teach a lot of people like, well, this is how you look at a resume for this particular job.
right.
So I think the teaching part was big there for us as well.
I I have an add to that. Um, there's another technical recruiter I think very highly of in Seattle, and I was talking to him about um, how he goes through evaluating applicants, right? So going through the ATS and stuff. And the one thing he does differently than I do or did, I now am adopting this, is for about every 100 resumes he parses through, he will pick one out randomly and interview that person.
Hmm.
And the reason is because people writing resumes is a crapshoot most of the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have a really good resume and it really does tell the story and you can really pick it out. But there's a bunch of times where you look at it and you're like, I have no idea why this person
Yeah.
applied. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So can we flip this around? We talked about CTOs. Let's talk about candidates for a second. Let's imagine I'm a candidate or there's candidates listening.
Yeah.
How do you write a good resume? I mean, not like, a textbook of have the objective, blah, blah, blah. Like, what is it that you as a recruiter are trying to get out of the thing?
Okay, that's a good question. There's a number of things. First is, job description match in terms of background. That's a big piece. So it's like, do they have the requisite number of years of experience? Do they have the right degree? Um, have they done things that match up to the role? So I look for those kinds of things. Um, I do look a little bit towards their ability to convey information clearly and in because I think that's an important skill that transfers. It also illustrates that they probably code well because language is kind of code. Um, so those are the principal things that I look for. A lot of times for resumes or people who are applying and stuff, there's just knockout factors that come to bear really quickly. And usually when I'm evaluating resumes, I look for the knockout stuff first, right? So one of the clients I had, it was a medical startup, and they dealt with sensitive information, sensitive data and stuff. And so people had to be in the United States. Now this is a remote role, but anybody outside the United States was automatically kicked. And you just kind of look for those things that make for a rapid transition of making a good decision or not. But for the people who pass through those no factors quickly, and you're really evaluating for their skills and stuff, you do look for, is this person ready for this role by their descriptions. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your
Fascinating. So
question though.
well, it does. I mean, it tells me something, which is it's actually a very almost black and white evaluation. Like, are the criteria met or are the not criteria not met?
Yeah.
Um, which is interesting because then that comes back to something we were talking about a minute ago, the importance of, on my side of the table, our side of the table, being clear about what you want.
Mhm.
If I go out there and say, find me someone who knows how to use technology X and not technology Y,
Right. Right. And
that's going
this
to
actually
happen.
is, yeah, and this is actually an important point on LinkedIn profiles too. I just
Mhm.
had a buddy of mine who was declined for a job because he had used sort of generic words to describe things he had done as opposed to the technologies themselves. And a lot of times when you're looking through applicant stuff, you want to see the technologies that they've used in the jobs that they were in, to see their progress and how they've evolved over time.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I always wonder about it is funny, like the alphabet soup of like, C++, Node,
Yep.
Java, blah blah blah. And it's fair that like I definitely look at that and
Hmm.
say like, well, this is our stack is this.
Hmm.
And so does that person have experience in that? And then sometimes it's so funny you say this because like I don't even know how I mean like listing that, it's like it would take like a page of alphabet soup to list all the things I've ever done, you know?
Right. Right. Exactly.
And so then it's really like this, I guess, and I guess I'll ask you as the recruiter, and this is kind of to Scott's question about the how does the applicant do a good job of this? Do you recommend that applicants essentially make custom resumes for the job they're applying to, where they specifically pull out the things that they have in their experience that aren't being asked for, and so that the things that they are being asked for are at the above the fold, right? Or
Well, that's a good question. For software engineers, so you guys probably have a broad audience, but for software engineers, what I generally recommend is write a default resume that has everything. And then when you apply for a given job, put the stuff in that makes sense for that role and stuff, and then bring that out. Now, the one speaking of C++, I have a bias about software engineers, and software engineers who have coded in C++, I think are better, a cut above. Just and it's just they you have there's a complexity there that I think makes a slightly better person, better engineer, excuse me.
yeah, interesting.
But that's a bias of
So
mine.
it's
What do you think? What's that?
That's a bias of mine. I don't know that other recruiters would necessarily have that. So.
well, it's interesting you say that because you remember the checklist I was talking about a few minutes
Mhm.
ago. I remember that one of the check boxes on that checklist was did something technically difficult,
Right.
Yeah.
right?
If you built
Which
something in C++, plus plus, you did something technically difficult.
right,
Yeah.
that was a so one of the check boxes was familiar with our stack. One of the check boxes was
Mhm.
probably like has worked on a website before or something like that. I don't
Yeah.
remember them all, but then there were a handful of check boxes that were things um like that. I don't remember what the other ones were, but things like they kind of try to tell you more about the individual. Um, but it's interesting that you talked about looking at the concrete qualifications because as maybe I'm doing it wrong because often I review a resume, I sort of look at that, especially for more experienced engineers. I tend to think, well, experienced engineers done a lot, they can adapt probably to whatever stack we're using.
One would hope.
And then I'm trying, yeah. But that's valuable to know that they've used whatever stack we're using.
Mhm.
It's not always a deal breaker. But then I'm trying to figure out from the resume, and this is what I often get frustrated with when I see the alphabet soup. It's like, okay, that's like saying I have a toolbox with a bunch of tools in it,
Mhm.
but what did you do with them,
That's right.
Yep.
right? And did you make a car? Because we don't make cars here. We're like actually making medical devices. So if I worked at a car company, that'd be cool. But
Right.
like, so it's to me, I'm trying to like I'm trying to understand both what is this person built with their
Mhm.
tools and what is the sort of arc of their career like? What's happening with this
Right.
person,
Oh, I want to talk
right?
about this. You've got it. This is a great topic. So yes, the alphabet soup matters. And I think what you're kind of pointing towards is context is really important, especially in terms of the things that
Hmm.
you've accomplished. And I had this really strange experience where there's a person who's recommended me to me after the big layoff at Microsoft after the COVID stuff happened. And and so I took the call and I had him send me his resume, and he was in the devices group, which was just cut completely, right? And so I read through his resume, and this guy was amazing. I mean, just holy cow. And it started with he got out of school, he had a master's degree, and he'd done a bunch of work in statistics. And so for whatever reason, in Microsoft's infinite wisdom, they assigned him as a tester. And so he's working on all the stuff that's coming in from Dr. Watson logs and those sorts of things. And it was very manual at the time. So I think that he'd started like at 2008 or something like that. And so you'd look at the bug and you'd match it up in the bug database in the RAID, and then figure out kind of who the developer was and then assign it to him and stuff. And he realized this, I could automate this. And so he created this completely fully automated system, but it would take in the bug reports, match them up to the software that had been written, and then to the developer, and then alert them via email to go fix the thing, right? And just that alone, I was like, how much money did that guy save Microsoft? And he was probably just like, oh yeah, it's obvious we should just do this thing, right? And he's a really unassuming guy. And I just couldn't believe that like this guy was having a hard time getting recruited or hired anywhere, because it's obvious this guy is like one of these engineers that's going to be a principal staff engineer someday. You can see the arc. And it was just, and so I hooked him up with a well-known VP level kind of principal engineer person to help him evolve his career and stuff, because it was just he needed somebody to guide him along.
And the point behind the story is that this is somebody who you could see in their story an arc that was compelling,
Yeah.
but you had to like read through the tea leaves of their resume to get that. Like you only got that when you really kind of talked to them. Is that kind of the point of the story?
Well, it was in there, right? And the point was that it's not just about the soup of the different kinds of technologies that are being used, but rather, he had enough of a story in there about what he had accomplished that you could see that time after time after time he gets a new job, and they put him in this really just hard work, difficult to understand, and he comes up with the answers. It's just super consistent. And so that kind of consistency of solving those hard problems was what really sold him on me. So that's kind of the thing that I think was really important in terms of telling the story. I wish I could just show the resume, because it pops. But it does pop in like the way that most marketers think about popping, right? It's just like
Yeah.
you guys would have read it and said, yeah, I want this guy on my team. He solves problems.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So what's the other side of the coin? If I'm a candidate, how do I just shoot myself in the foot with my resume?
Oh boy. Lying is a bad idea.
Well,
Overstating kind of, what you've done and stuff can be problematic. um it's and sometimes it's not obvious because like especially for startups, and I'm curious about your how you guys think about this, but people hiring managers will say, well, yeah, we should go hire some people from the following companies or whatever, and they'll tell a recruiter to go hunt those people down. And those are handy rubrics, but the question I always come back with is, so what are your values? What are you hiring for? And do the values from that company match to you or not? And it's one of the things I think I was really curious about with respect to both of you guys is when you're spinning up a startup team, startup engineering team, what are the values that you sort of start off with and use as sort of filters of the people you're interviewing?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you now because I spent most of my time in like the the biggest company I ever worked for was when you and I worked together at Real Dave, and
Hmm.
in the grand scheme of things, that was still a relatively small company compared to like the big guys, you know.
Yep.
And
Yep.
when you're on a team of, you know, tens of people, 10 or less or 50
Hmm.
or less,
Hmm.
you that requires a sort of a willingness to be flexible. That requires a willingness to kind of like check your ego at the door. It requires a willingness to be incredibly scrappy, right? Like,
Hmm.
it's, there's this part I've seen this type of failure consistently where if somebody might have years of great experience inside a whatever they call a fang these days, but like if you were if you were at a company that had 10,000 employees and you led a scrappy team of 12 people in a 10,000 employee company, that is not the same as being a member of a 12-person startup. Like it's nowhere near the same,
It's no. It's
right?
entirely
Like,
different sets of skill sets. Yeah.
Let me
yeah.
give you an example, and it's a personal one, so I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but it's a good one. I was at a startup. I was at a startup. It has nothing to do with technical, but it tells you the story of something about a startup. So you're the 12-person team in the big company. You still have a massive amount of infrastructure around you. Okay. So I'm at a startup. There's 5 engineers on this team. And we had a little lunch break room. Well, actually, it wasn't even a lunchroom. There's nowhere sitting there. There's a place a counter to get coffee, coffee, sink, refrigerator. Okay. And just everyone leaves their coffee mugs in the sink. And it's really bugging me. And so finally, I decide I can be bugged, and someone puts a sign up, classic sign, your mother doesn't work here, clean up your coffee mugs. Nobody's cleaning up their coffee mugs. Sidebar to the sidebar. I once worked at a place where someone's mother did work there. I think his name was Michael Johnson. And the sign said, unless your name is Michael Johnson, your mother doesn't work here, so clean up your coffee mugs. Anyway, so this is going on for a while. I'm getting annoyed. And finally, I just decided to say to myself, well, you know what? I guess part of the CTO's job description is to clean the dishes in the sink. So that's what I'll do now. And for me, mostly I was doing that emotionally, not to be aggravated every time I walked into the coffee room. But to me, it's also a symbol of, or a symbolic of, at a startup, what you were saying about no ego. You just have to be, you have to actually enjoy doing whatever it takes to get the job done. There
Right.
is no, that's this other department that's going to do it. That's an HR
Right.
problem, or that's a facilities problem, or that's a QA team problem. It's all just all of our problems. And so
Right.
you have to look for people who for that, and you have to look for people who enjoy that and who've demonstrated that before. I think is tremendously valuable.
And I think that there can be a real culture shock for somebody that comes from a non-startup environment into a startup environment where they don't they just it doesn't occur to them that, like, yeah, actually we all have to fend for ourselves here. We all have to be willing to do the thing, whatever that is, whatever, you know uh file our own bug reports, test the other developers' code, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's like you can either call it, you give a shit or you care. Either one of those two things, I
Hmm.
think, is kind of what you're talking about.
well, and I also think that it's not necessarily just that if you're from a big company, you don't give a shit or you don't care. I think it
Mhm.
doesn't even occur to you that like, hey, if I don't report this bug that I just
Mhm.
saw, no one else is going to,
Right.
right? Because if you're used to sort of having this massive support structure around you, it's like you see a bug, you're like, "Ah, I'm sure somebody found that bug and reported it already.
Right.
There's 10,000 of us.
And certainly the janitor is going to come through at the end of the night and clean up the kitchen, yeah, all the things.
So then there's another attribute I think you have to look for, which is resourcefulness. And actually, I'll put
Mm.
another one with that, which is what I'll call a mindset towards leverage. So resourcefulness, you got to figure out how to get more done with less, which leads to a mindset with leverage, right? A lever is getting more done with less. And um, so you need people with a bias towards action who can be resourceful and get stuff done and do it in a way that actually gives the team leverage and allows the team to get more done and not do things in a way that slow the team down. And
Yeah.
these are all just like crazy soft skills, right? They're not,
Mhm.
they don't show up in the alphabet soup, right? Uh,
Right. Totally.
they show up in, to go back to your example, Dave, they show up in the triage of bug tickets so that people
Right.
didn't have to do it anymore. Right. And
Right.
nobody asked me to do that. I just did it and it worked and everyone was happy.
Yep.
Um, I think those are all attributes to look for sure.
You know, there's another part of that, Scott, that I 100% agree with you about the sort of leverage. But the other thing that's really important in a startup, and I would actually argue this is probably important in any like, um, not yet profitable company, right?
Hmm.
And that is like we're burning daylight, and we need to
Hmm.
be really, really, really thoughtful about every little side quest that we have because we don't have the resources to do side
Hmm.
quests, you know? And so this notion of not just doing things that get you leverage, but really picking your battles, right? You know,
Hmm.
don't over invest early, right? You know, a really simple example of that might be like, look, if you're building a new feat, like this is one of the things that Agile tries to help teach us to do, right? Like get your thing out there quickly so that you can get feedback on it so that you can know whether it's even worth continuing to invest in, right?
Hmm.
Like, don't make the thing perfect before you release it
Hmm.
because you might make a perfect thing that nobody wants,
Right. Right.
right? And that's like this, that's not just leverage, but that's a very much this mindset around I have to be really intentional about what I spend my time and energy on,
Hmm.
or what I even advocate that we as a team spend our time and energy on,
Hmm.
because we don't we're burning daylight here.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've been talking about engineers a lot. Could we switch gears for a second and talk a little bit about engineering managers or engineering directors or VPs and what those resumes look like and how to identify those people?
Oh, that's a good question.
Let's leave out the VPs. Let's just
Yeah.
talk about engineering managers and engineering directors.
Okay. Yeah.
I've come to you, Dave, I've said, hey, we are going to hire a new director of blank,
Yeah.
machine learning, data science, software engineering,
Okay.
data engineering, whatever. What do I need to tell you in order to have you be able to be really effective at that search?
Okay. Um, First off, what do you need them to do? Like, what's the
Mhm.
mission? Where is your team? What are the challenges that this person's going to solve for you, for your team?
Mhm. Mhm.
How much do you want them to be technical, and how much do you need them to be more corporate managerial? And what I'm really
Mhm.
asking there in saying that is, do you need them to do the budget and understand how that process works, or
Mhm.
do you just really need that person to do the technical stuff in a hardcore
Mhm.
way, right? And so it could be like you might be shading it more towards like, yeah, I need this director, but they kind of need to be a staff engineer too, a little bit. in terms of like coaching,
Hmm.
bringing up the engineering team kind of thing. So what are their soft skills? How good are they at leading, bringing their team along to be successful in total, but also in terms of developing the careers for each of the engineers as they're going forward too. So I would
By the
ask
way, this
those
sounds a
things.
lot like, yeah. So Dave, it sounds like one of the things you're basically saying is kind of what we said earlier, and what we talked about with Ted about, which is this notion of like know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
And as a recruiter, do you find that what how common is it that like most most people know what they're looking for, or do they not know what they're
most
looking
people
for?
think most people think they know what they're looking for. They really do think at the
Hmm.
beginning of the search that they know what they're looking for. And about 90% of the time they end up hiring someone who is not what they originally thought they were going to be hiring. And you just get informed in the marketplace. Part of it is, there's the unknown unknowns, right? Both in terms of what you think you know, but also in terms of what is on the market because you haven't looked for this particular role for the last 5 years or something like that, right? Things have evolved,
Hmm.
and so that kind of comes into being. And it's not just you that's going through that, right? It's everybody who's part of that chain of the recruiting process. So anybody who's interviewing is going to be having the same kinds of double clutching that you're going to probably have to. And so all of those things have to be taken into account over time.
You know, I think it's interesting that I love that you kind of pulled out the question of like not just the technical skills, not just the soft skills of leadership and
Mhm.
management, but then the other parts about sort of like business acumen of knowing how to do a
Mhm.
budget, knowing how to think about the implications of that new hire, or if you are doing a budget and next thing you know there's a reduction in force or
Right.
something, like how do you really think about like the team that you have and how you live with less and how you choose how to live with
Yep.
less. And that's like so many pieces of not just the technical, not just the sort of like people management, but also the where's the business going? How do I think about where's the
Mhm.
business going? You know, it's interesting. Certainly the more senior the person is, the more those demands are going to be uh,
Yep.
appropriate.
Part of that too, Brad, is when you hire this person, because a lot of times you'll be like, take the director role, for example. You might be hiring someone who's currently a manager and maybe they're at a bigger company and they've had some startup experience. And so you think that's okay. Um, there's some coaching things you're going to be having to do with them for certain. And do you feel comfortable with that in developing that part of that relationship with that person too? That's sometimes somewhat overlooked in that at that level of a
Hmm.
role.
I had a one of my mentors, actually, Martin Plain. You'll remember him, Dave, from
Oh
Neural
yeah.
Networks.
Oh gosh, Martin's
Um,
great.
one of his things he kind of talked a lot about was this notion of like executive mindset. And
Yeah.
when I first became
Hmm.
a VP, it was with him, and he talked about this notion of executive mindset being trying to balance and actually maximize, not balance, but maximize, your value to your customers, the value to your shareholders, the value to your employees, and the value to the community at large, right? And that if you
It
that's
sounds very much like him.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that idea, it's so interesting because one of the things I notice with there's a lot of times first time managers um really lean into but I'm here to support my team, right?
Mhm.
They think of
Hmm.
themselves as maximizing that the employee vector. And of course there's all kinds of things some anti-patterns there that could get created, like ruinous empathy or something like that, where you're too nice to the team member that's actually struggling, and you're not
Mhm.
really doing them any good, but you sort of think that you're the manager that everybody loves, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and instead thinking about like, hey, look, it doesn't like ultimately like if we're not delivering the software, then
Mhm.
we're all at risk here. If we're not meeting
Right.
the needs of the
Mhm.
shareholders, the company, right? If we're not meeting the needs of the customer, right? Or we're writing software
Mhm.
that nobody wants, right? Or we're writing software that
Right.
constantly fails, right? And it doesn't matter if we're enjoying ourselves and having a great time and love birthday parties. We're not we're not really achieving our goal as a manager and a leader.
Right. Right.
It's been a super fun conversation, Dave. I'm so
Yes.
happy that you reached out to us
Yeah. Yeah.
to talk about this.
Yeah. It's totally fine. I agree. I certainly hope that you guys develop an audience with the recruiting people because I think it'll help.
We will. So if I was a hiring manager who needed to hire a recruiter, where would I find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Dave Hardwick. That's fine. And then yeah, I respond to DMs and email messages and all this stuff. So
We'll definitely include your profile in the show notes of this episode.
thank you, Craig.
Yeah. Awesome.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Good talking
Thank
to you,
you
Dave.
guys. Appreciate being here. Cheers.
This episode of How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast was edited by Saffron Hefta-Gaub. Our theme song was AI generated by Brad. Please follow us on all the social media platforms at How Many CTOs Pod. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, TikTok, and Patreon, or at our website at howmanyctospod.com. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Thanks for listening.